Thank you all. You've all been working so hard all day that I have another treat for you. You already know Charity, but she is going to be spending the next 30 minutes in a fireside chat with Joe Beda. Sorry, I got it wrong. I even checked. Joe Beda. I'll get it. We're going to have 15 minutes of questions from Charity and 15 minutes of questions from the audience. So all of the questions you've been bottling up all day can flow forth. If you don't know who Joe is, he's the CTO of Heptio. He is the creator of a few services you may have heard of: Google Compute Engine, Kubernetes, Google Container Engine. Don't know if any of these ring a bell. I learned today that he started his career working on Internet Explorer, tying back to Emily's point that the browser is an unappreciated glory of our civilization. I've got to run and get the questions, but I'm sure Charity and Joe will keep you entertained with small talk while they sprint.
Well, in terms of introductions, where was that on a scale of 1 to 10?
Pretty
good.
Yeah, no complaints. Thank you.
I always love the opportunity to dig up a fact about someone like, used to work on Internet Explorer.
At the time, I will defend,
you were young.
Technology-wise.
You needed the money.
Well, have you used Netscape Navigator?
Whoa!
Just saying. Let's talk about layers versus the modern DOM.
I haven't.
I'm just going to say that.
I don't run Windows.
What's that?
Because I don't run Windows.
All right, yeah.
Thank you.
You didn't run Windows before it was cool not to run Windows.
It's true. What operating system did you start out on?
Let's see. I think my dad bought me an IBM PC Junior.
Whoa.
So I started out doing DOS, playing like King's Quest on that thing back in the day. Yeah.
Was BASIC your first language?
What's that? I did BASIC, and then I remember I learned C out of a book, and I remember the time when it finally clicked to me how pointers worked.
All right. So much about you and how the man who created Kubernetes now explains itself to me.
What I
that
like
your first
complexity.
Language was C. Yes. 8-year-old Joe Beda. Pointers. I know how
I
this
can tell
works.
you about my kiddo. He's
.. Kubernetes.
No, my son is all into Windows and all these abandoned technologies just to troll me.
Oh, that's really sweet. Well, so let's talk about Kubernetes. There's a lot of things that people will say about its operability, its friendliness. But how can observability help Kubernetes users?
So, I think Kubernetes it's a sharp tool, but it's not the tool for every problem. So I think the first thing to recognize is that if you have a single computer problem, Kubernetes is not the solution for you.
Sure. Or a lamp stack problem.
Yeah, and so it's our aim when we started out with it was to build something that would work for a few machines and then grow with you as the problems that you were solving grew in complexity also. In terms of observability, if you're doing, I think a lot of folks will use Kubernetes to manage a lot of simple applications, right? And so this means that you have a load balancer, maybe you can share a load balancer across a bunch of applications, then you have a single container image that you're replicating and maybe a database on the back end. Observability can help there, but that's not really where things start to sing. I think a lot of folks will combine Kubernetes with multi-tenant SaaS-like applications or more complex microservice applications. And I think, having a rich view in terms of what's happening across your entire system between those components and making sure that you're collecting the right data and being able to view it in the right way is really critical.
A thing that I love about Kubernetes, though, in this sense, is that it forces you to make the jump to some good best practices for distributed systems. You can't just SSH in and run strace on your app every time that it,
I mean, you can.
I mean, you can, but it makes it hard for you. Your system should make it easy for you to do safe things and hard for you to do things that you shouldn't really, right? And the thing I like about Kubernetes is that it kind of forces you into this orchestration model of your processes are out there running. You have to instrument them in such a way that they explain themselves back to you through instrumentation, in aggregate and in individual, and you get used to approaching it that way instead of you've got your GDB, you've got your developer environment, all that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think there is this. It encourages you to actually be a little bit arm's length to this stuff. Think about how is this going to play out over time. Excuse me. But I think even within Kubernetes, we're still learning the best practices. I think you can kube control run something and get something up and running right away, but that's not necessarily the right way to manage stuff over the long term. So even if you're running on Kubernetes, there's gradations in terms of how production ready you are.
Great agency, yes. What's on your wish list for managing Kubernetes?
Oh, man. Well, I think the biggest thing we need to work on right now is making sure that it's boring. I think we talk about this a lot. Good infrastructure is boring.
Yep.
It fades into the background. It's
like
not
a
surprising.
Freeway. There's one direction to drive down the freeway.
Exactly. And I think, right now, Kubernetes is too exciting. And I think we're seeing that like people are laying more things on top of it. And those things bring a lot of value. But
now you have end problems.
But it brings a lot of more complexity. And I think there's already enough complexity for folks to swallow with plain old Kubernetes. So I think it's going to take time for it to get boring, for the abstractions to be well understood enough that it's not this sort of esoteric, crazy thing from the future.
Time to kind of lay down some grooves in the road.
Exactly. So I think that's the biggest thing that we need. Beyond that, I think that we are starting to enter a world where people are building some level of automation on top of it. There's best practices. Seeing those things start to calm down and congeal, because right now there's just, have you all seen the Cloud Native Computing Foundation landscape?
Oh, yes.
Isn't it like this eye chart?
Open source is here to help.
Well, like one way to look at that is that there's an amazing amount of innovation going on when you look at that chart. And so from somebody in the industry, it's really exciting to see so much going on.
Yeah.
As a customer looking to use this stuff, it's absolutely horrifying.
It's very dizzying.
Yeah.
It's interesting to think about how the landscape, on the scale of a single application, we could write it, we can run all the tests we want, but anyone who's ever operated anything doesn't trust it, right? You don't trust it until it's baked for a while in production, because you can't predict all the things that are going to get thrown at it, and it feels to me like the entire landscape is kind of going through this. Like we've built all these tools, we have great theories about how they're going to work together. Lots of people are trying things in chaotic and fascinating ways, and it's going to take a while for it to kind of bake and for it to figure out what actually resonates and actually works.
And and I think just like with an application, with observability, you want to have the tools so that you can actually know what's happening, right? Because you can have an application running and you're like, I have no idea what's going on. It must be fine. Woohoo! I'm going to sleep well at night, right? I think the same thing with Kubernetes is that over time, we're going to understand the best ways to observe it, the best ways to know when it's healthy, when it's not healthy, and that's taking time to actually have that stuff shake out.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Does the phrase software ownership mean anything to you? If so, what?
Yeah,
what
so I
comes to
think
mind?
there's this idea that the buck stops with the people who wrote the software, right? I think part of an enterprise, IT culture is this whole throw it over the wall type of thing, and I don't know what DevOps means. I don't think anybody does.
Nobody does.
Right? But there's a kernel of truth there, which is that developers don't have the luxury of not understanding what's happening on the operations side. And anybody who's wearing the operations hat doesn't have the luxury to not take those lessons and actually plow it back into the application to make it more operable over time. So some of that is observability, some of it is just building the tooling, some of it is knowing how you're going to roll out and manage this thing over time. Early on, I think, and this was my experience at Google, is that the people who write the software are the ones who run the software.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're going to build something that's totally not operable.
Otherwise, it's literally impossible. Yes.
Thank you.
We could get away with not doing that while our systems are simple enough.
Yeah, and I think I'm not convinced, and I think this might be a little controversial, that model of you write it, you run it, actually makes sense for all time, right? When you're running something like, say, Google search, having a set of experts, and I'll follow this on-call rotation that are at the first line, that SRE model makes a ton of sense, but you better believe that the developers are held accountable for making sure that the applications are operable.
There are a lot of different tweaks and spins on this model. I think to me, all it fundamentally means is you need two sides of the coin. You need both ability and empowerment, right? If you don't know how to make the changes, if you don't have the skills, whatever, it doesn't matter how much power you have, you're not going to be effective in running that software. And likewise, if you have all this knowledge and you understand the software, but you don't have the power to roll things out or make fixes or even to look at production, you're kind of screwed too. And we've kind of split up into two teams, and it's not that everyone has to be equally good at both or doing both all the time. But I feel like in order to be a software owner, in order to have a culture of ownership over your software, you kind of need to make sure that you have at least the basics.
Yeah, and I think there is this transition. Like you look at mainstream IT, and we are seeing this transition now where you can't avoid the fact that there's a better way to do things, right? If you are an IT manager in Midwest Bank and it takes you 3 months to roll out a new version of your website, and even then it's an all-night, all-weekend type of thing, and you got to roll it back twice and everything breaks, and meanwhile you're getting apps pushed to your phone on a daily basis, you got to know there's a better way to do this. And I think we're starting to see that realization percolate out through the rest of the extended industry. It's not comfortable, it's not easy, but I think these companies are realizing that they don't have a choice at this point, right?
Yeah, and I feel like we can be kind of negative when we talk about these things, or always kind of focusing on the downs. I mean, it's professional hazard, I guess, but it's actually a better world. I keep trying to remind myself to talk about it this way. It's better. Shit breaks less. You're in it with someone. You have a team. You have, it's not just, congratulations, you have 10 more responsibilities, have fun. It's like, no, actually, like the shape of like your paging rate should go sharply down. Or you're right, it's not worth it. But this is a better way.
So now with Heptio, we're working on bringing Kubernetes to enterprise customers to essentially help that transition, help these folks see a path from where they're at now to this. I call it cloud native, but you can call it whatever the hell you want, but see a path to that new world. And it's not an easy transition because they have a whole bunch of constraints that I think a lot of folks in this room really don't internalize and understand. But I think about it, and so like I was reading this thing on like how do you motivate millennials because I'm old and I have a gray beard, and it's like you got to convince them like how their work is going to improve the world, and I'm like crap. How is like like pushing Kubernetes to enterprise is going to improve the world? And the reality is that the average IT job in these organizations, there's a hell of a lot of drudgery. It is not a good, and people don't feel productive, and when you don't feel productive, you're not happy with yourself. And so I think that with these tools, and like it's not a silver bullet, a lot of organizational change and support needs to come with it, but with these things, we can really unlock an enormous amount of human potential across the wider industry.
Freeing up your time from all the things that you have to do so you can do more of the things that you want to do.
Exactly. Higher leverage things.
I also don't know what cloud native means, but that's
all right,
fine.
I can give you my solution.
Please, by all means.
So I think it's a set of tools, processes, and organizational practices that really support self-service, automated, infrastructure and applications. So it goes beyond just the tooling. And it's essentially a lot of times when people move to cloud, there's really two things.
You have to adopt these things.
What's that? There's running on somebody else's computers. And then there's reworking your processes to take advantage of the unique aspects of cloud. And like there's so many enterprises that do the first one and not the second one, and then they spend millions of dollars, they wake up and they're pissed off that they didn't magically turn into Netflix. Right? And so cloud native is like, let's concentrate on that second thing, because that's really where all the value is. How do you actually change your processes to take advantage of those unique aspects?
Well, there's a theory that I've heard that as logs and metrics are to virtual machines, so observability is to cloud native. What do you think of that?
So I'm going to piss you off and say I'm not really sure what observability means.
No one is.
I'm here at the conference, and I get an idea. It's an expanded view. It's an expanded view of just understanding what the hell's going on with your your software.
I can give you. I think
is that you ringing, not me, right?
Is that? It's me. How embarrassing. Well, I can tell you what my definition is.
Yeah, give me your definition.
Well, the control theory term says it's basically how much you can understand about a system just by observing it from the outside. So applied to software, that means to me you can ask any question, you can understand what's happening, no matter what that question is, without having to predict what those questions will be, without having to ship new code. Right?
Okay.
Without having to ship new code to answer a new question, right? So it's like finding that level of abstraction where your system is explaining itself back to you. And a bunch of things sort of proceed from this, in my view, like metrics, not observability, because you have to pre-aggregate. And if you have to pre-aggregate, then you had to predict what questions you're going to ask with these. I also think that I see your skepticism, but think about it for a minute.
I got a question for you. I'm just waiting for you.
And I also think it is about moving from the monitoring the view of the world, which metrics do really, really well, to the view of the event, the health of the world as experienced by the event. Doesn't matter if your system is 25, 30% down to your application code, if it can get the resources that it needs to do its job. What you should care about as an engineer, not as an infra person, but as a software engineer, is how the experience of every single request, so that you can slice and dice by shopping cart ID, by any different things you don't have to predict in advance.
All right. So my question is there perfect observability then, by your definition?
No, of course not.
Okay. So observability is a spectrum with Nagios on one end.
Yeah.
And with honeycomb on the other end.
Yes. Sure.
No, what goes past? I mean, because I think one of these things is you're okay, so you can ask it without having to ship new code, right? But if you forget to actually, as you're logging your events, if you forget to record an AXI, right?
For
Or if you're doing request tracing and you lose that request ID and you have something become a black hole,
it's a
right?
spectrum, for sure.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. There are some things that make it possible or impossible. There are some things that make it easier or harder. But yeah, absolutely. It's a forever moving target too. What have you learned in the open spaces sessions?
I'm sorry, what?
What have you learned in the open spaces sessions today?
So I was the facilitator for the serverless and observability thing. And well, first of all, we can try and define serverless, but I don't think we have enough time. But one of the interesting things that came out of there is the failure mode for most systems is really one of the system goes down or you corrupt data. I think with automatic cloud systems where you have a credit card in the loop, the failure mode ends up being that you spend a lot of money, which is an interesting thing. And so there's other consequences for not actually understanding what your system's doing beyond just bad user experience. It could also be bankruptcy or begging Amazon to please forgive the fact that you screwed up, right?
Oh, yes. We are automating problem causing as well as automating solutions.
Yeah. So that sort of special failure mode of this stuff hadn't really clicked for me before, so that was really interesting.
It also makes serverless extremely hostile to any form of staging.
Yeah, it is. I mean, you're not just testing in prod, you're developing in prod.
Exactly. Yeah, I've often said that I feel like one of the carrots that gets dangled in front of us, and it's never worth making a big change to your system like this unless it's at least 10x better, right? It has to be 10x better than what you had if you're going to do any sort of rip and replace or huge upgrade. But in my experience, one of the immediate benefits you get out of changing from a model where you're monitoring for questions that you predicted in advance to a world where you're asking questions and exploring is that you can drop the number of your paging alerts by orders of magnitude. Think of how much we rely on these clusters of alerts firing to let our intuition go, it's Redis.
Well, now, do you think you replace those alerts with common queries so that you can actually go through and
they're starting
can start
points,
digging in? Yeah.
Right? Ideally, they take you to within sniffing the last 2 or 3 tweaks of the question to the actual solution, right?
So, I mean, I'll be honest with you. I mean, the last time I was on call was at Google, and when we had issues, we didn't have the honeycomb-like systems. We had Borgmon, which is a lot like Prometheus.
Yeah.
And those dashboards were a starting point.
Yeah.
Right. But you could actually have certain levels of, it depends on what your system is, you have certain levels of degrees of freedom. And I would find that oftentimes during that, I found myself creating new graphs on the fly based on that. But you still ended up being limited based on the cardinality of the axes that you can put in there for sure.
Yeah. Do you have any questions for us?
What? You didn't warn me that I was going to have some questions.
That's my last question.
Okay, so you are a reluctant CEO.
An accidental CEO.
Accidental CEO? Okay.
Also a reluctant CEO.
Yeah.
It's fine.
Yeah. What has been the biggest lesson for you as a CEO? Right? Because I'm going through our own startup journey, and I wish somebody had warned me it was this much work, by the way.
The hardest thing for me has been shifting my internal sense of how I bring value.
This is why I'm a mediocre manager.
Yeah, me too, man. I can't. Then like the things where you have a meeting with someone every week at the same time, I'm like, I can't, I'm not, I still don't feel like I bring any value whatsoever in things like meetings, and which is not true. I can't feel it, which means I don't get the right dopamine cycles, set up.
No, that's critical. I think for good managers, my take is that management is a skill set in and of its own. Like I started my career at Microsoft working IE, and I think it's safe to say, maybe they've changed, but Microsoft traditionally has done a really good job of turning good engineers into shitty managers.
Yeah, we have this pattern in the industry of like...
What's that? Historically, not right now. Now it's great. That was a long time ago.
No, we're like, you're the best engineer on the team. Let's make you stop doing that.
Well, and I think the motivations are very different.
Yeah.
Engineers get that dopamine hit
high
from like, I did this, look what I
it.
created, right?
Yeah.
And managers get that dopamine hit of, look at how successful I made everybody. Yeah. And it's a very, very, very different motion.
And the mode in which you're supposed to operate, being a good manager is all about freeing yourself up for interruptions and handling them gracefully. And being a good engineer is all about blocking out interruptions and going deep. Yeah. And you simply can't coexist in the same tube at the same time. Anyway. Thanks so much for coming.
Out in the audience, if anybody has any questions for Joe or Charity.
Joe can solve all your Kubernetes problems right here on stage.
Oh, we even have microphones. You're running a professional show here.
I'm not. Kelly is.
Hello, or from Rookout. So you're working on Kubernetes, and you're at the forefront of how things are developing, and you've touched on serverless today. What do you think about the gap between those two and things like Knative coming out now? And what's your projection to how things would progress?
So I was talking to somebody from IBM the other day, and she's leading up a group working on the IBM mainframe business, which is a growing business. It turns out that IBM is growing that revenue stream. Ooh. And so, like these things don't disappear. We are in an expansionary industry as a whole, and so it's not VMs or containers or serverless. It's really VMs and containers and serverless. And I think what we're finding is that and in serverless, the difference between serverless and PaaS, I don't know. There's definitely there's a connection there, and depending on how you look at it. But I think what we find is that each of these things has a different set of trade-offs in terms of constraints and capabilities. And the more choices we have, the less of a cliff that you go off of when one of these things doesn't work for you. So if you're doing something with serverless and you hit a limit and you hit a wall, right? Dropping down to doing a container as a service thing makes a ton of sense, right? And I don't have to throw everything away. If you're using something like Knative inside of the Kubernetes ecosystem, those things can communicate and talk to each other in a way that is relatively natural and fluid. Without that, then it's like, Heroku doesn't work for you, here's a VM. And the gulf between a VM and Heroku is absolutely enormous. And so I think we're getting better at finding the sweet spots along this sort of, complexity curve. And I like what the Knative guys are doing, by the way, a lot. So, up there.
Hi, I've got a question around when you're talking about the enterprise organizations, and I've had experience in that as well. And I guess, how do you see, I was fascinated, I tend to see that people are quite keen to move into that space, but they've got systems such as SAP and Pega where you don't have access to source code. So, and I actually see also small fintechs, well, not small, but fintechs who are they've always created their own source code, and they've got to the point where they're now saying, well, my God, the expense of, keeping creating this source code, and look, we could actually buy a whole bank here for, X, Y, Z. So, the temptation to move into these packaged systems, which would seem that it doesn't align itself to this kind of future that we all sort of want to be part of. And I just wondered, have you seen or had any ideas around how to solve those types of vendor, inclusions and things like that?
Yeah, well, let me see if I can answer that. I think, one of the things that I think brings a lot of value with Kubernetes is that, and again, this whole thing of like cloud is moving to somebody else's computers plus adopting these things, is that you can do this stuff incrementally. Like these package systems, these existing systems, they're not going to go away anytime soon. If you move to cloud as an enterprise, then you're stuck with either moving these systems into the cloud, which is possible, but it's a heavy lift to try and rip the Band-Aid off and move everything at once, or you're running some stuff on cloud and you're using some sort of VPN to call back to these things, and that's not a great solution either. So I think what we're finding is that again, it's not an either-or type of thing. Organizations can use these systems to actually be able to work with software faster, be more reactive, while actually continuing having a close connection to their existing systems. In terms of the sort of maintenance burden of these things versus buying an off-the-shelf piece of software, I mean, we're seeing that happen all over our industry. Like, who here is running their own email server? Right? Unless it's your business, right? Do you guys run? You're not?
Not at work for play.
Why would you do that?
It brings me joy.
All right. I'm not going to touch that. But like, like the use of SaaS is just another part of that calculus, right? Whether it's a packaged piece of software that's run locally or it's SaaS, it's outsourcing something where you're not adding core value. So if you're a fintech company and you're writing a bunch of software and it's not actually affecting the bottom line, like that's not a smart business decision. So I think everybody should focus on what is the code that I write that's really going to move the needle and add unique value for my company.
Innovation tokens is the Dan McKinley term for it. It's like if you're a startup, you have 3 innovation tokens. Spend them wisely. Because every time you try and write a database or do
yeah, how's that working out for you?
No, we have not written a database. We wrote a storage engine.
Should we define those?
No. But like every single one of those eats up a lot of your time, and you want to be sure and spend them on the things that have the most impact on your business, most differentiators.
Well, and I think the other thing to keep in mind is that the risk factors and motivators for enterprises and startups are very, very different. If you're a startup, like
you're probably
number one,
going to die.
What's that?
You're probably going to die.
Yeah, so your concern is like, am I going to be in business next month? Not like, am I going to get locked into this cloud platform, or it is, whereas if you're an enterprise, like, and let's say you're, animation house down in LA, and you're like, I need to store all the digital originals across 3 different clouds because I don't trust all of them. Like, that's the type of risk that these folks take on. And so it's a very different calculus when you're a startup versus enterprise. And I think a lot of folks in this world don't really understand how serious those risks are at the enterprise level.
Yeah, true.
I'm getting all businessy on all y'all.
Any other questions? Yeah? Mike?
You can yell it out. We can repeat it.
So as somebody that used to work at Google, and as one of our jokes today has been Google's problems for everybody, how do you think that that's working out? Like, should we all be trying to act like Google? Should we all not be? I struggle with this a lot myself as a recovering big tech company person, so.
I think there's a lot of lessons to learn. I think that there's a lot of lessons to unlearn too. Shipping a product at Google is, it's really hard. And it's really hard because, number one, Google systems assume that every developer is super smart. And so they'll do things like, we're turning off this data center, deal with it, right? And that's really hard. And not only they did that, but for a long time they did that with no good multi-region storage engines, which makes it even harder. They have Spanner now, which is a better solution there. Whereas I think for a lot of companies, not even just startups, I think on that risk thing, it's like, I'm running an Amazon in one region, like, once in a while they'll go down, I'll scream, but they'll come back up and the world will continue on, right? And that's a reasonable trade-off to make as a business, depending on what your business is. And so I think adjusting your expectations around that is a really important thing. I think another example is, and I think you look at like the pricing model behind App Engine is predicated on App Engine. This is traditional App Engine over time, which the pricing model, it gets expensive when you're operating that at scale. It's predicated on the thing being meteor-proof, right? Like a tsunami could hit, a meteor could hit a data center, and your app doesn't go down. And I think just like personal backup, I'm sure you have a really great backup scheme.
Rsync.
Yeah, okay. Just like personal backup, people don't value that at the price that it actually costs. And so, and I think that may or may not be rational based on the business. But yeah, I think that's a big part of it. And then, for startups, and for a lot of companies, the risk in launching a product is not that, we'll have too much load and we won't be able to scale, right? The risk is that I launch a product and nobody cares.
Yes.
Right? That's a much more likely thing, right? And so I think for me, retraining yourself for that, like, hey, you got to move faster. You don't worry about that stampede and that success disaster, because the biggest thing is making sure that you can validate the product and what you're getting out there.
One of my favorite rules of thumb is that you should never even try to build or architect for more than 10x what you have now, because the world.
So what happens when you have 0?
Well, fucking mathematicians, I swear. But the world is going to change. The assumptions that are true now are going to be different. So the thing that you think is going to break first probably won't break first. Putting Azure Horizon just 10x now, it really helps make decisions quickly and appropriately.
All right. Are we out of time?
Like crazy, but we've got to put Joe on a plane, and we have to listen to the findings at the end of the day. So a big hand for our.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Charity.
Thank you, Joe.
That was awesome. Thank you.